Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the conversation where we take everyday issues pervading throughout society and break them down for you to understand. My name is Hriday Mehta and I shall be your host for this podcast. We have with us features writer Harsh Unhavne from The Contrarian and a very special guest, Devika Harlalka. Devika has completed her master's in education from Harvard University and is also the co-founder of SkillLab, which is a startup in the field of education in Mumbai. Devika, it's great to have you on our show.
All right. Devika, through your years of education, you've achieved quite a bit, and we personally are really inspired by that. Especially your Masters of Education at Harvard really stands out for us. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that? Do you think that it's important to study about education? Could you tell us a bit more about your specialization in that field?
Of course. Thank you, Rudra and Harsh. Happy to be here and offer my 2 cents about the education space. So, regarding your question, let me give you a little background about my educational qualities and requirements. So, I did my IGCSE and IB from Dhirubhai Ambani International School. After that, I pursued my BA in psychology from Emory University, post which I started my startup Skill Lab in Mumbai in India. And then I went on to pursue my master's in education from Harvard University with a concentration in human development and psychology. So, your question about whether it's important to study about education is one that really fascinated me and guided my educational journey because, as we know, the environment in Mumbai, in India, it's not that typical for students to pursue a master's in education, an MBA, a doctorate degree, a specialization in engineering is something that we've all been raised to think about that that's the right track. So it was unconventional for me myself to explore, to think about whether I should do an MBA or get my master's in education. But I'm really happy that I decided to pursue my master's in education because if you think about it, education is important in every aspect. If you do not have high quality professors, teachers, and educators that come back and teach in your home country, you continue to propagate the same system that continues to promote something like rote learning, which we all know is super ineffective. Like, I would like to ask you, Harsh and Hriday, what is it that you remember from your early years of schooling if the type of learning you did was rote learning, just based on memorization? Because in my
Yeah,
personal experience, I did not learn that much. And so, what does that say about our
yeah.
education system and in terms of practical skill building? So, I do think it's very important for more and more people to understand that education is a valid career path, and more importantly, to make that active effort to come back to their home country and try and work on education there, because that's where real change starts.
All right. I absolutely agree with your ideas. Devika, our magazine's name is our venture's name is The Contrarian, which means that we are looking out for ideas that are radical, world changing, some ideas that no one has ever thought of before. Were there any debates or were there any topics that you all discussed at Harvard or Emory that might be considered radical but effective?
For sure. This is a very interesting question. And what comes to mind is a recent debate in one of my Harvard classes. So, while studying about human development and psychology, one of the topics we really spoke about was parenting and how parents, the definition of what is an educator, right? Like, is an educator only a professor, a teacher in a formal institution? Or can you be an educator just by being a parent or a person in a high leadership role because you are influencing minds, you are shaping people? So, just in extension to that debate and conversation, something that was extremely radical, in my opinion, was this idea about how in our current society we require tests for everything. For example, if an 18-year-old wants to learn how to drive, they have to pass a driving test in order to drive because that comes with a certain sense of responsibility. So, it's interesting to ask how when someone becomes a parent, what about would we have this possibility of having a parenting test, like, or provide courses and education to recently turned parents, because there is a lot of research and data that suggests like the way certain parents conduct their parenting, the parenting style they choose, and how that affects the student, and then later on in their educational years affects the way they can retain information, can learn, can study. So that was something that was extremely radical. Just the idea of having someone tell parents that you have to take a parenting test before becoming a parent, like the ethics of that, and if that would ever work out. But what's important from that conclusion of that decision is to think about how important the role an educator plays, right? And who all can be educators. And it's not limited to just professionals alone.
Okay, that is actually quite an interesting concept. The fact that you have to take a test to become a parent. It's not something I've heard much about before. And the thing is, when you usually, from what I've heard, is that, say, my mother learned how to be a parent from her parents. So she either learns from the mistakes they made and does not repeat them, or she takes the good, like she uh, learns the values that were imparted to her and imparts the same values to us. So I think it becomes a question of, is the role of a parent imparting education, like imparting knowledge or skills, or is it more of just imparting like basic values?
That's a great question, Hriday. And I would just like to correct you. There is no test that has been formed that's a parenting test. It's just a
Okay.
hypothetical discussion that we were having.
Yeah.
Mainly because in terms of whether there should be courses or workshops that parents would want to attend where they can retrieve information about data and
Mhm.
research that different parenting styles have on students. I think that would be something that's more viable instead of having a blanket statement like every parent has to take a test, because that sounds absurd and unethical.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of your question about values and what a role a parent must play, I think that's a very personal and individual question. It also is highly interwoven with different aspects, right? Like, what is the parent's education qualifications for themselves, and what is their
Mhm.
socioeconomic status? What how privileged they are to be able to do this. A lot of parents are working full time. Do they have that kind of luxury and space to offer? So I think it really is a personal decision that each family has to make, but I definitely support the idea of having courses out there that parents can optionally take that explains to them the research that human development and psychology has already done on parenting and the correlation to educational achievements for their children later on, because that would be extremely important.
I think that's a really amazing idea. I mean, I feel like personally, everything that I've done in my life, out of that, nothing has really prepared me for, say, parenthood. So I would honestly, going further, love to get all the help. But it's interesting that you mention a practical aspect of education. I mean, something that education doesn't teach you, like parenthood, because there are also a lot of other things that we aren't taught in schools, that when we enter the real world we get exposure to that. Like, we weren't taught about how to invest in the stock market, we weren't taught how to pay taxes, we weren't taught how to get a job. And I'm sure you've seen all the memes where they talk about how the secret to getting a job is saying that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, or like describing photosynthesis,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So I would like to ask you that, what is your take on that, and what can schools do differently to prepare us for such situations?
Of course. And in fact, it was this guiding question that, brought me to starting and co-founding SkillLab. So at SkillLab, what we do is we provide social impact and leadership summer programs. And the reason why the skill building is important is because this is what I reflected upon, that my time in school and formal education, there were a lot of times and certain skills that I did not get from schooling, but I found it to be extremely important and applicable later on. For example, leadership skills, confidence building, public speaking, research. Like, these are not aspects that were as well highlighted in school, but I think are important when you're joining the workforce, and just in terms of interview preparation for when you have to apply for a job. It's not only about the grades you have or the achievements and internships that you've done, but how do you present yourself? How do you talk? How do you make a pitch? And following that, of course, I feel like there's such a vast discrepancy in terms of financial knowledge and how must one handle that. And I think the reason why this is probably also given our socio-cultural context, right? Like, most of us do live with families, a lot of our financial decisions are handled by parents and grandparents. So it's not something that we have
Yeah.
actively think about. But it's so interesting in my time in the United States when I had conversations with my peers at the age of 18, they usually leave their sheltered homes and it's
Yeah.
them who are in charge of their finance. So they know so much more about how to invest, what to do, whether they should invest in the stock market, mutual funds, or how they should take care of their assets because it's a decision they're forced to make. So that makes me wonder personally as well, like although I'm 25 now, I do not handle my personal finances to a level where that I would want to, and that's just because simply I know that I have the safety net and my father, who is in the financial market, to make these decisions for me. But it makes me wonder that the educational system should provide certain programs or workshops for students to bring to at least inform them early on, at least have the knowledge, even though you might not be practicing daily, at least know what's happening. Because I think if COVID has taught us anything, is how unpredictable life is. And
True.
God forbid anything happens to your family, you should at least know what to do with your finances and your resources. So I do think it's a very important skill.
Yeah, I completely agree with your point that we need more practical based education. Uh, we pride ourselves on our academic rigor based curriculum, but I feel like we're not doing that properly as well. I mean, we are humanities students and we look to apply to universities abroad, and I believe that one of the strongest reasons for that is that we don't have a strong research culture. Everything that we learn is from the textbooks. So do you believe that we need a stronger research culture, especially in cities like Mumbai, and how should we go about making it stronger, if yes?
Of course. I think the answer to this is more nuanced and complex than yes or a no, mainly because with research comes complications and questions like funding, right? Like thinking about the socio-cultural
Right.
context we are in. Um, it's always easy to be like, yes, we should have more research opportunities. I would love to see institutions within Mumbai, within India, conducting research that is worthy and published. But who is going to fund this, right? Like what are the practicalities, who are the students, who are the observers, super just higher up in the authorities that will make it happen. Because it's not only about doing research but having the research be done systematically, have the data be accurate, have it be recognized by institutions that are verified. So ideally, yes, I think it would be great to have more research done, especially within our cultural context. And this is interesting because I read about this in one of my classes at Harvard, which spoke about research. Was a lot of the research that the United States publishes is done, tested, and the trials and the participants are Americans, right? So it makes me wonder about what about research that could have been done in countries like India, in Mumbai, and whether results would ever be different because there's so many
True.
differences. So then, are the conclusions from the research that's being done abroad, is it still viable and applicable to us? And are there,
Mm.
because if you're talking about social factors like education, retention, leadership, or parenting, I think it's so different across cultures. So then it makes me
Mm.
wonder, like, what are we basing our information on if it's not homegrown? So I would definitely urge this push for research, but I also do understand the limitations that we have as a country. But I think with people being understanding that education is important, there in our generation there are more people wanting to get their undergraduate degrees, master's degrees. So that itself is a change, and there's somewhere this ripple effect is coming along, which I think would go a long way. So I think it's just taking it one step at a time and doing what we can.
Yeah, even usually whenever we're using research statistics or something for public platforms, we usually quote stuff like studies at Stanford University have shown us this, studies
Right.
conducted by Harvard have shown us this. So, do you think that it's something to do with the amount of funding that's given to universities abroad and just the vast number of universities there are that engage in research compared to, say, I could probably name the Indian research institutions, I could probably count them on my hand, where you have your IISER and your Homi Baba institutes. But do you think that we could provide these research foundations with more funding, or just simply have more of them in number?
Of course. So to answer the first part of your question, I definitely think funding plays a large role in deciding who gets to research and who are you researching and how are you researching, who is authorizing your research, and all these questions are very important when conducting research. Like what came to mind is how there's been a lot of cultural appropriation. Like recently there has been this shift on where people are producing research reports on, for example, benefits of turmeric and milk, which, as we know as
Okay.
Indians, is something that's been done for years in the past, right? So, like,
Yeah.
it's interesting how, or for example, let's think about yoga, the benefits of yoga, and how culturally appropriated that is, because once, I guess, international research organizations verify this, it then becomes valid. And what does that have to
Yeah.
say about students and what knowledge and what information we think as knowledge, right? Like, of course, if our grandparents were to tell us, beta, wake up and do pranayams, do kriya, do yoga,
Yeah.
we would probably not listen to that. But if we see a Harvard article that tells you the benefits that yoga has on your cardiovascular system, and immediately there's a change in mindset. Same thing with haldi doodh, right? If someone phrases it as turmeric lattes or like turmeric milk and how good that is for you in terms of your sleep patterns, if you read a vetted research article produced by, say, a Stanford or an Ivy League institution, immediately you accept that as knowledge versus when you hear this as layman's information in our own country. So this question also makes you wonder what is knowledge and who has the power to create what knowledge is. So, just questions to think about when you're scrolling through BuzzFeed articles or just social media in general.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, when I was a kid, that's how my mom would get me to have turmeric latte. And I even remember, yeah, I mean, I even remember going to like Starbucks and all in different countries and seeing yellow milk or like stuff like that selling for $5, $6. And it
Right,
would, yeah, it was crazy, like look at the way yoga has it's become really trending in the West. And it's funny that we are taking yoga from the US and bringing it over here, when in fact it's
right,
actually the other way around. Uh,
right.
Cultural appropriation in research is a really nice topic that I'd like to read up more about because I've not come across that concept yet. I mean, I've seen it in like outfits or food, but in research is a new thing for me. So thank you for introducing that concept to me.
Of course. In fact, I'd like to comment on this. I'd taken a class in Harvard called Emancipatory Inquiry, Research Inquiry and Methods. And that class was extremely radical because it changed my notion about what research has to look like. With my formal education at Ambani or Emory, I always thought of research as, there has to be an independent variable or dependent variable, a certain amount of sample size, there has to be data, statistics. But this class at Harvard taught me that there are different forms of research. It's just that this formal way of research, that like doing statistics and taking interviews, is the research that's highlighted. But what about photo-based inquiry? What about collecting narrative-based research, which is just giving people the platform and the voice to share their experiences, and how that itself is also counted as legit research. So that's radical in
wow.
itself, that there are art-based research, like how you can create research that's recognized simply by looking at paintings, is something that I would have never thought about before taking this class. So that was interesting.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting for me also, because I myself have been getting into the research space a little bit. And as someone who is more interested in the financial economics side of things, I think this whole concept of narrative research is quite new to me. And I think a lot of the people tuning in right now also have very similar questions as to what's the best way to begin with research, and like where do you start? I think that's what most people are confused about. So if you could just give them a little bit of advice.
Of course. So I personally feel research is very important, and having done research in the past, that's why I include research-based workshops in my Skill Lab Leadership summer program, where as students as young as grade 8, I like to introduce them to at least simplistic concepts about primary research, secondary research, what plagiarism is, because I think that's something that a lot of Indian institutions and schools don't do. If you don't necessarily have an international program, you don't have repercussions like Turnitin or these websites that verify for plagiarism. I know a lot of my friends who went to local colleges, they have personally told me how they would just Google essays and reports and change it a little bit and submit it in because it was a hard copy and no one would be able to catch their plagiarism.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
items and this comments and thoughts like this make me very uncomfortable because it is an offense, right? Like, it is a criminal offense to plagiarize. So it makes you wonder, what is the attitude towards education? What is it like? Why are we so obsessed with marks? And you'll do anything to get there, but then what are you really learning? And what is the role of education? Are you just doing it to get a degree, or what are the moral concepts you're taking on? Because what you learn so early on then transfers to your jobs when you're working in the workforce. So it has just so many larger implications. But in terms of, I think, where can you start, I think any point to start would be great, right? Like, firstly, just making yourself aware. I think awareness is the first step, and just taking it one step at a time, researching and looking out for other programs and opportunities that start you young and form this foundation where you do have at least instructions or knowledge about what is right, what isn't, what is okay. Like, plagiarism is not okay, and a lot of
Yeah.
institutions fail to see that, and I think that itself is a problem. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that is so true. And so for just the people listening in right now, I think one platform that would definitely help them out is your platform, that's Skill Lab. And we would just like to thank you for your time. It was really great talking to you. And it was great to have you on the show. Please do check out Skill Lab. We will put the links in the description down below in the comments. So do check those out. And thank you so much for joining us. It was great having you.
Most welcome. Happy to be here. For all of you listening, if you have any responses or feedback about the conversations and the content we had, happy to have you write to me as well. So that you can pass on my contact details, my email ID, and keep thinking and keep challenging what knowledge is, where it comes from, what you think, because nothing should be just taken at face value. So that's what I hope all our listeners here take away from this session is just think and reflect and don't just take information as is. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
that's
so much.
amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you guys for tuning in. And as always, the conversation starts here.